Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Get Jashed. Today I am super excited to have with me Mike Campbell. Mike is a men's coach, author, founder of the School of Personal Mastery coaching program for men, creator of Beyond the Beers, host of the Everyday Legends podcast, and supports everyday men from across the globe who are questioning where they're at in life, how to sort their shit out and get what they want in relationships and life. So Mike's purpose is in bringing about a new way for men to communicate effectively and confidently navigate their lives. With loving straight talk that he delivers so well, Mike makes personal development relatable, accessible, and applicable for men. So you can see why I wanted to have him on here. Thank you so much for joining me, Mike.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
Excellent. I wanted to touch straight on, because these conversations are predominantly around communication and leadership, but it really depends on who I'm talking to as what can be shared in that arena, right? Which is the whole point. And since you are specifically in the area of coaching men in their lives, what does effective communication mean to you in the context of men?
Well, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is like a giant rabbit hole, really, because effective communication is, in essence, is what I'm teaching. And so, I would say the potential is this huge spectrum where, we're wanting to work on effective communication. But for one guy, that is being able to simply tell his partner that he cares about them, or that he is challenged by something. That's effective communication based on his current yardstick. And then for others, it's perhaps more advanced, or at least that's what we're working to. So I suppose the common thread in all of that is, certainly for the men that I work with, is actually kind of coming back to base, and that is communicating with ourselves. And so because we often have lots of nice conditionings and messages about, how we should talk and what we should, all this kind of stuff. But before we get to all of that, like actually just be in conversation, be in communication with yourself. And what does that look like? It kind of looks like actually just stopping and listening for a moment. What are the thoughts that race around my head? What are the stories that I, spin about myself and the world around me? And like, what are my feelings? And that communication to start with, I think, is the baseline perhaps for any further effective communication. But that means actually just settling into listening to ourselves.
Yeah, I see it as like, it's almost like emotional communication, because as you mentioned, like there's a lot of conditioning that men have that in this instance, women are very fortunate because we are raised and allowed to have emotions. It's not always positive in the way it's conditioned, but we're allowed to be emotional, or we're expected to be emotional because we are women. But men traditionally, and I know that it's changing gradually over time, but traditionally men don't have that allowance. They're not really given that kind of permission. There's like the dogma of things like suck it up or be a man or show your emotions. So I imagine that it must be challenging in some ways, or some men, to communicate with themselves in that way and even acknowledge their own feelings and emotions and what's showing up for them, rather than just kind of distracting and going off.
Yeah. And so, like if I'm to have an effective communication or communicate effectively, or have a decent, real, raw, honest, open conversation, let's say with my partner or anyone, right? A parent, doesn't matter, a friend, at work, you're feeling undermined or micromanaged, like you get to have a conversation about that. Then, that kind of communicating with self is, first of all, like acknowledging, is there something here that I need to address and discuss? Like that's the first, step, is simply being an inquiry. And then that can hopefully lead us to the next thing and the next thing. But it needs that mode of inquiry, I suppose. Yeah. But, for a lot of men, of course, as you said, it's not a blanket, but we do have some fairly blanket things and ways of being and beliefs. And, for a large part of our society, certainly up until this point, there's been a general, feeling, a general belief system that, you know, men shouldn't show emotions and all that kind of stuff. And that is, you know, really painting a broad brush, because of course it's not the case for everyone. Some people rebel against that completely and are completely ruled by their emotions. And then there's those that, you know, float in the middle. But I think when you are dealing with a lot of men who have, you know, been raised / part of their DNA / kind of socialized to be very heavily in the masculine, very rational, very logical, very detail focused, very looking for a problem so I can fix it, right? It's a mode that is, you know, in one moment a great strength, and the next moment like a terrible weakness. Like, what are you doing? Stop trying to fix things and just shut up and listen. But, you know, that if that's the mode, that's the mode. It's very hard to get out of it when you don't know anything else. And so a lot of men in that state, and when I say in that state, meaning that's their mode a predominant amount of the time, there's a question that comes to talking or, you know, expressing my emotions or whatever. And that is, well, what's the point? Because we're looking for the point. I need a point to something. And the problem with that is it's a question that becomes rhetorical. So in an ideal world, I would ask the question, what's the point? And then attempt to answer it. Look for a point. But it's almost said as a statement. There is no point, is what is generally said or generally meant when we say, what's the point? Because, you know, then we can potentially see, oh, well, you know, maybe I won't keep burying all of this stuff down. And then, you know, one time a month, maybe when I blow the lid inappropriately, maybe that won't happen, and I can connect more with my partner. And like, there's lots of points, but we tend not to look for them. And so, you know, again, hopefully the idea is to invite a bit more inquiry into that, and we can find some more points, some more effective communication.
Like with the points there, it's kind of about getting curious about the possibilities, right? Because there are so many points, but they are all possible. You know,
yes.
Not definites. It's all things that it's like, maybe I will feel more fulfilled in my relationship at home. Maybe, you know, like we'll feel more connected because I've shared and she shared or he shared, you know, like whoever it is. But they're all possibilities. So it's almost like an opportunity to get curious about.
Yeah, but then if you're uncomfortable in that space, then it's not tangible, you know. And so if it's less real, or if I haven't experienced it before, then it's unfamiliar. And, you know, maybe there's a whole lot of discomfort and a whole lot of fear of, you know, what happens. Maybe I'll be rejected, you know, maybe there'll be judgment. And so those things tend to rule, and they're often very conscious. Sometimes they're not as conscious, but my experience is, if those fears aren't that conscious, it's more just that we've become so good at ignoring them that, you know, they're running the show, and we justify out the other side of it.
Yeah, we don't need to look at them anymore, and we just don't need to, like, because feeling can feel too much as well, especially when you don't know what to do with it.
Yeah, well, then I could be controlled by it. So this is a very common mode for a lot of men, in that, you know, again, who kind of sit into this general level of being, is I need to control my emotions or they'll control me. And it's, you know, it speaks to a common theme for a lot of men, which is we're black or white, very all or nothing about things. That is a masculine mode, to be very detailed, one or the other. And when we're not so familiar with the gray, it's terrifying. So we want things to be all or nothing, and it comes out in many, many ways. But, you know, dealing with our emotions is one. If I'm not controlling them, then I'm going to fall apart, which you might in an instance if you've never allowed yourself to, let's say, feel an emotion. Not that the whole conversation about communication is emotions, of course, but it's certainly one common area of dread and limited capability, let's call it, for a lot of guys. And so, you know, if you're not good at something, it's foreign, you don't feel safe, you don't go there. It's as simple as that.
Yeah, I guess especially when you can't predict the outcome as well. And it sounds like, from a woman's perspective, it sounds like all the same fears that again, generalizing, but we women have, but it just shows up in completely different ways as well.
It does, yeah. I mean, safety is kind of the theme there, and safety is so paramount to everyone. But again, to genderize, to help broaden things, but of course, this is not black or white. In my experience, a lot of men fear safety in different ways to how a lot of women feel safety. But it's still a huge driver. It's just that it manifests differently, as you said.
Yeah, definitely. Do you, with communication in general, whether it's emotional communication or otherwise, and bringing it back to communicating with, like themselves, do you find that there's a particular motivation that gets men to that point where they decide to do your work or not?
I mean, yes. And so perhaps a bit of context, and that is, you know, when I speak to men, it clearly sounds like I'm generalizing, and I am, but because of course there's such a wide variety of men, and I'm tend to deal with, you know, a certain section of the population, but I also tend to think, if you think about a bell curve, I'm kind of in the smack bang in the middle of that bell curve. And so awareness is not necessarily that amazing. And so there's a lot of scope, I think. But for a lot of men, unfortunately, the motivation is like rock bottom, and maybe not rock bottom, but some kind of ultimatum, some kind of the horse is bolted moment, right? Shit has had to get so bad that I therefore have to do something. And, you know, we all know that that can generate huge action. It can be extremely positive in a way, but generally speaking, I liken it to if you're attempting to scramble up a landslide, you know, like that shit's falling down and it's catastrophic and you're not going to get anywhere. At best, you're going to stay put. You're still on something that's falling down. And so the idea is to be able to jump off that thing, right? And so how can I get to a place where I'm not trying to save something if it's my relationship, right? Versus, hold on, because that's now externally focused. So how can I actually do this for me? So therefore, you know, how I show up, my relationship changes, etc. So, you know, that kind of motivator is, because I come across guys like that all the time. Something really bad's happened, and cool, my job is not to, let's say, fix your relationship, but let's work on you, and then you can deal with all that stuff, because that's your job. So maybe linking from that, one of the common motivations is around relationships. But yeah, I see the cost of, perhaps the result of, a lot of the way that, you know, men have taken on, this is how I'm supposed to be, is I just brush everything off. And the more you do that, because certainly when it's small things, right? What's the point? It's small, don't worry about it. I just brush them off, and I just brush them off. And then it gets to a point where, you know, so many straws, one more and the camel, his back breaks. And so it's a challenging place to, you know, claw your way back from, I suppose, for a lot of guys. Now, that's not everyone. Some guys, it's totally different, you know. I know there's maybe more available for me. I don't know what it is. You know, is it something greater in my life? Is it a bit, you know, a stronger relationship? So it's kind of the next level up is that. I know there's more available. It's super broad, but it's because it kind of is, depending on the guy. I don't know how to get it. I want to get it. I don't know how to access that. I feel like I'm stuck in this kind of limbo spot. So it's that desire for like getting out of / getting towards something, which is unknown, but I know it's better, that kind of thing.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think, like, with the broadness, you can only speak to like what you've experienced, right? Like, it's hard to speak to everyone, especially like you said on that bell curve, where you may not really work with the outliers, or that if you work in that middle, then that's the common element that comes in. Do you find?
But also, let's not, like, those can be very close together.
Yeah.
Like, there's a lot of guys, I would say, experiencing that second one, but don't do anything about it, and therefore they quickly succumb to the first one.
Yeah, that's true.
Right? Yeah. I wish I'd done something then when I had that fucking nudge on the shoulder, but I didn't do it. Yeah. Right. So they can be very close together. Yeah.
Following you, like, I've been following you for a little bit. I came across you on another podcast. You were a guest there, and it was so great. And I'm not even a man, and like following like what you have to say, and I know that you speak to this as well, that what you share relates so much to women in a way as well. And I think there's an element of feeling heard and feeling acknowledged. Someone's acknowledging, like, you know, our needs, or what we need our partner to do for themselves. Because it's all about, like you said, it's all about like taking care of you, and then the rest kind of works itself out, and it's really just focusing on you. So that's kind of that's an interesting achievement for you to have.
Yeah, not my intention. But, you know, like I would have to be blind not to see that that happens. And I, you know, get a huge amount of correspondence, I suppose, and engagement from women who, yeah, are communicating something along those lines. And also, you know, things that are relating to them. But, you know, one of the things I suppose is, and you know, maybe a very common question is along the lines of like, how do I get my guy to do this stuff, listen to the stuff, you know, whatever, do some like change. And, you know, part of what I see that I do is like a metaphorical, like taking a guy by the shoulders and shaking him like, fucking wake up, bro. What are you doing? What are you doing? Now, of course, what I hear in that and what you're sharing is, you know, a lot of partners, female partners of men are getting to a point where they would like to be able to do that, right? Or they feel like they need to, but that's not effective, right? And unfortunately, for a lot of relationships out there, that kind of step needs to happen, needs to come from another man. Except, as I said before, maybe that rock bottom thing happens where there's like an ultimatum. And I had this, and I'll speak to it very broadly speaking, so no one is identified, but just 2 weeks ago, I had a conversation with a guy who's come into my coaching program, and it came about because his partner, his wife, said the exact words, "You need to get your shit together or I'm out of here." That's rock bottom, right? And that's shaking by the shoulders. Well, that's more son of kind of the rug out from under him because he had his head buried in the sand for so long. And so, you know, I could have said that to him, but part of the idea with my content, not all of it is that way inclined, but is to give a loving nudge and an opportunity to, you know, look in the mirror and kind of step forward. Yeah. And so, you know, I see perhaps the frustrations come through in a lot of women who consume it. And then, as you said, you know, a relief perhaps, and like, oh, finally someone is offering this to the men out there. And I also see such, you know, because it comes from a place of love, right? You know, the woman that I hear from it, oh, this is amazing because I can understand so much more. In fact, I got a message this morning about someone saying, you know, I understand so much more about the men in my lives now. And I just think, isn't that the best thing? Like, regardless of what's coming from me or wherever, you know, regardless of the content as well of a relationship, and we're not even talking romantically, but if we just talk about society, we're so quick to pick sides. And when we do that, we don't win. And regardless of what the sides are, we need that two-way empathy and compassion. And that's certainly the case in a relationship. And, you know, a perspective that a lot of women have never even considered is, have you thought about what that man has been through to get to where he is? Because whilst you've clearly and no doubt been through a bunch of shit, for two people to really meet in the middle there, that needs to be able to see from the other person's perspective. It needs compassion and empathy. And if you can see that, you know, again, broadly speaking, he's grown up to hear that he needs to be fucking Superman and everything to everyone. And if he isn't, he's useless. He's not worthwhile. He doesn't deserve to be loved or happy. And like, that's a fucking big burden to bear, you know? And so all of a sudden when you can get that, oh man, you see someone differently. And hopefully that might open different lines of communication.
Yeah, it's definitely from that place of love, because like so often, whether it's like you said, whether it's a romantic relationship or a friendship or your brother, or whether you're a woman or a man yourself or otherwise, it's so tough to see someone that you love suffering in their own, or even if you don't recognize it as suffering, seeing them limiting themselves, having limiting beliefs about themselves, or holding back, or getting down on themselves, or putting all this extra pressure on themselves that is so outrageous and unfair and unrealistic as well.
Yeah, and just doing shit that you can see isn't serving them.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like, why are you doing that?
Yeah.
Like, I don't know if you ever had this, this is quite common, maybe I was a younger brother, maybe in my household, but, you know, like where the older kid would grab the younger kid's hand and hit them with it.
Oh, yeah.
You know, it's like, why are you hitting yourself? But that's almost what it's like. You're looking at it, it's like, why are you hitting yourself? What? Yeah. You're actually doing the hitting here. Why are you doing that?
Yeah, that's such a great analogy. I feel like anyone with siblings can.
Yes, yeah, maybe with siblings, or, you know, bullies, whatever.
feel free to share as much or as little as you like with this next one, but because I imagine that you would have gone through your own kind of growth process and realization process from rock bottom as well. How long do you feel like that took, or what was it for you?
Yeah, so, well, it's one of those things, like I often get a question along the lines of like, how did I get into this work, and what am I doing? Did I go through something really big? Because that is the case for a lot of people, who might end up, working around coaching or personal development or something. And I would say under that definition, perhaps not at all, but it's been a long, slow process just of me as a human. Now, I would say, I wouldn't call it rock bottom, but perhaps when I started to shift gears a little bit was when I was about 20, how old was I? 24. And I moved, I'm a Kiwi. I moved from New Zealand to Scotland, and I was playing rugby. Now I was living in the middle of nowhere, basically by myself. And all of a sudden I was with myself a lot. And I started to like have these realizations. And one of those was, broadly speaking, like, man, I'm in my head a lot. And, there was this interesting period, it was only about 6 months, where I kind of went into some, I wouldn't say forced self-inquiry, because I could have not done it. I could have distracted myself and so on, but I paid attention. So that kind of started things, but it wasn't rock bottom in any stretch, right? But it was the start of me looking like, is there something different here for me? I don't know. And then skip forward a few years, and I, had a period of darkness, I suppose, to really label it. But I moved back from the UK to Australia with my fiance at the time. And not too long after that, I received a phone call one day. She was in New Zealand at a friend's wedding, and I was meeting her over there the next week for another friend's wedding. And it was a Sunday morning. It was Valentine's Day, actually. And the phone call, and I was like, hey, babe, how you going? And I just had this silence. And that was a very heavy silence. And, what came next were the words that just absolutely pulled the rug out from under me. And that was, I can't marry you. And, and I was heartbroken and devastated. And, the next 10 minutes and the next, 10 days and the next 10 weeks were, just awful. And, a real like searching for understanding, and at my current level of understanding and awareness at the time, it was all like, well, she needs to give me the understanding. But she could only explain what she knew as well. She just had a truth in her that she had to speak. And, now I can see, man, just so much respect and admiration for that, because fuck, they took balls. But at the time I was devastated. And now at the same time, my mother was also very ill with lung cancer back in New Zealand. And so I was going back and forth quite a lot, and often the premise was, we think this is it. And so that was like rushing to the airport in a cab, buying a plane ticket at the check-in counter kind of stuff. And so there was a lot of heightened stress and shit outside of my control at that period of time. And so it was weird, because in one capacity, so the very next day after my relationship ended, I was working as a personal trainer at the time. I started at my new gym, and I was building a business. Like I had to get in, sell myself, so there was like all these conflicting weird modes that essentially saw me, kind of withdraw into myself quite a lot. And because I think that initial process that had maybe started a few years earlier over in Scotland, I went into inquiry, and I went into, how do I figure all this shit out? How do I make sense of this? The relationship, how did that come about? What's my part in that? And, then seeing my mum very ill, like, life is fragile. Holy shit, and then also from this very low place, having to build a business. And so like having to reach into areas of myself that I hadn't perhaps done before. Like I have to really fucking put myself out there right now, and so all of a sudden I was stepping into some different modes of being. And so I would say across a period of about a year, there was a lot of self-reflection and a lot of, deep digging and a lot of exploration, but, really a lot of growth.
Yeah. I what I envisioned as you were talking just then was it's like a different kind of showing up for yourself that you went through, because it was
Yeah.
like the internal exploration and inquiry and curiosity, but also the shit, I'm stressed as fuck and I still have to show up and build this business because what's my choice?
Yeah.
No option.
Well, and that's the thing. So, I was in survival mode in a sense, like I basically come back from a long time away in Europe and, enjoyed a expensive trip at the end of it. And, I was living at my sister's house and I was in debt, and it's like, well, you got to build a business here or you can't eat lunch.
Mm.
And also it's nice to be able to be with your sister and your brother-in-law whilst your heart's broken and have people around you. But at the same time, there's this like desire to also be able to like, they had a tiny little apartment, to be able to like heal in my own space, if nothing else, a bit more.
Yeah, no, that definitely makes sense to me.
Yes.
Do you think that that's a challenge? Like, I'm curious in general anyway, like, do you think that that's a challenge for that broad stroke of generalization, men, to allow themselves that time when they are stressed or when they are feeling big things, is going, how do I take my own space here, or find that balance?
Yeah. So again, like, this is where, I would say something like a lot of men, in my experience, put their own needs last.
Yeah.
But I also know that to be incredibly true for a lot of women.
Mm.
But as we said before, I think what happens is they come about and they play out in different ways, right? So to say men are doing that is not to say women aren't. But for men, a lot of men, if you take on my mode, not always, because it definitely happens for men who are fathers and have families, but not always. My mode is to build and provide and create. Then what that means is I have to just work hard.
Mm.
And so for a lot of men, that's a mode. And so being able to sit down and just be, like the amount of men that can't just not even take their phone to the toilet for a moment of peace because they've got to distract themselves, let alone prioritize enjoying, some time doing something they love. Should I be doing something? Is there something I need to be doing? So even just being able to sit, because the other side of that is, but then if I do, what comes up?
Yeah.
And generally what's going to come up is all the stuff that I've pushed down. That's uncomfortable. That's awful. I don't want that. So it's like this self-perpetuating cycle of believing that I'm not allowed to, and then also being terrified if I do.
Yeah. So not having the permission to, in the first place, whether it's from yourself or from, say, your partner or your friends or whoever is closest around you. And then,
yeah, but also putting that permission onto them,
yes,
thinking it's theirs, but it's not, it's yours.
exactly.
Yeah.
That's one of my favorite things actually to do, like in my friendships or relationships, is like set up those healthy boundaries just as part of the communication, and like, saying like, oh yeah, my cup's empty right now. I have a lot on, like I'm taking downtime for me, like, and again, it's a communication thing, but it's just communicating like the needs on that basic level that I think across the board has been not normal for a long time.
No. No, and again, so this is where, as I said, this stuff most definitely plays out for all humans. Where I see another example, as I said before, the black or white, all or nothing thing plays out for a lot of men. And by and large, what I do really mean there is the masculine, because there's a lot of women who are very stuck in their masculine. Is, well, but if I do stuff for myself, then I'm being selfish. And whilst that could be the case, no, that's the other end of the spectrum. Like one end, you're going into complete selflessness, and the alternative is not the opposite, which is being a selfish prick. One is, as you said, like, I just got to take some time for myself at the moment. But we can't, often a lot of men can't connect to that. It's one or the other. And so again, there's like, well, maybe I can give myself permission to explore, is there a different alternative in there? But the stuck behind who do you think you are, being labeled as selfish, And again, on a higher level, being judged just puts the brakes on.
Yeah, there's so many stories that like we can tell ourselves, and I can they are like from that masculine point of view as well of what masculinity means also, and even that skewed version of masculinity that, you know, is understood or rather misunderstood in that way as well. Do you go into that balance of masculine and feminine with men?
Yeah, I do. And it depends a little bit. So for example, I've just, and I am in the middle of like a total revamp in my coaching program and the content. And so traditionally in my program, I haven't gone into it in that much detail, which is to say, I'm taking them into certain things, and we're exploring certain elements and aspects without the labels and the terms. So as like, you don't need that now. Once we, you know, get perhaps more skilled at those things, and we'll be like, by the way, that's that and that's that. But oftentimes, like, if that's just going to add to the confusion right now, let's pull it back. And I think that's had a nice benefit. But then what I've also found is sometimes if I might use the terms, it's like, and so I've seen where, you know what, okay, maybe there's times where it would help anchor things a bit. So I'm in the midst of bringing that in a more structured way. So we were always covering it. Depends on how much I, you know, label it, let's call it.
Like, hey, guys, by the way.
Yeah, well, for example, you know, like the very first thing that guys do when they enter my program is they write a letter to themselves. And that's it. Right? They have some instructions and guidelines. But what am I doing there? Well, I'm inviting them to like drop into their feminine and like feel and explore and get vulnerable and be real. And well, in order for them to do it effectively, they don't need all of that to start with. But of course, that can connect the dots later on, right? So there's a lot of that kind of stuff. But yeah, the more guys, because again, for a lot of men who are, you know, very in their masculine, see things very rationally. Some respond to seeing information about, you know, the differences in masculine and feminine energies and modes and so on really well. This gives me like a framework, you know, and it's like, yes, but you can't, you got to also feel it and be it. That's the whole point. So, you know, like for some men, it can be hugely powerful. And I have seen for some, it can be like a bit of a block because they're so in that. And so, you know, maybe that isn't the thing that supports them getting through it. So there's, yes, huge need for it. Sometimes it needs to take on perhaps different ways of getting it across.
I think that's like the art of coaching, is just intuitively checking in and going, oh, I feel like this person will probably like have this big block up about it. So I'm just going to, you know, leave those words out for a moment.
Exactly. Yeah. But look, having said that, you know, I've got a few other little courses, one specifically about relationships, for example, and, you know, it goes heavy into it there because to me, if you're going to explore relationships and being a better partner, then you need to understand a lot of things, but, you know, and for me, one of the major reasons to explore the different dynamics and et cetera around masculine and feminine is to understand a big chunk of the animal that is still in you, so that we can, because, you know, there's all this stuff playing out at our cores, but our job is not to just be subject to those, but to understand them so we can, you know, make choice. And so I think, you know, there's so much power in learning those things. So yeah, if guys are choosing to dive into stuff with me specifically around relationships, then definitely we're going to explore it.
Yeah, that's cool. I wanted to, because you mentioned a little earlier about like how sometimes that message needs to come from another man, and obviously the communication element of having men around to turn to. So everyone, I imagine through COVID, not so much, but the beers. So can you explain the idea of that in terms of maybe changes? I'm not sure if that's the right word, or the depth of communication that comes out as a result of that kind of, that idea, that practice, that ideology?
Yeah. So, I mean, what I see very simple is that a lot of men are just living their lives on the surface. And where that seems to be more obvious than anything is in our conversations. And so we all have depth. And most men want to have lives and relationships of depth, but you can't get there if you stick to the surface.
Yeah.
And so conversations that are about, sport and anything, women and, work and the fucking weather, politics, whatever. All of that stuff and banter are beautiful and often an amazing way to be kept honest. But if we can't go beneath that, then we're in trouble. We are denying a huge part of our experience. And so, again, we've genderized through this. I'll say a lot of men in their relationships might put every element of depth onto their partner. And so all of a sudden it's her job, perhaps. And so again, when I say her, this could easily be the feminine, and regardless of the makeup of the partner. That's not fair. Your partner is not your therapist. And so whilst you get to connect with them, you need to be able to, who are you going to talk to about her? We need to be able to connect and speak about what's really going on. But, we've learned this thing that we just need to deal with that shit ourselves, all that kind of stuff we're talking about before, but it doesn't work. So the mode of being on the surface is safe. But at the same time, in my experience, most men are dying to go beneath the surface. And, I use that word specifically because, generally speaking, about 75% of suicides are men. And not going into the depths is killing a lot of men. So how do we do it? Because the next thing is like, how do we do it? And it's fucking easy. This is the point. It's so simple. Most men are dying to have real conversations, but we're also fucking terrified because we don't want to be judged. We don't want to be seen as weak. We don't want to be seen as wrong or not knowing something or not capable, not good enough. And so we don't. But at the same time, so many men have this thing about loyalty. And I did a podcast on this recently because I feel like we have it generally misconstrued. But either way, how we tend to view loyalty looks something like, I've got my mate's back. Great. You know what? Let's use that. And so how we can use that is most of our mates, if we were to say to them, you know what, I'm just struggling with something at the moment. Like, can you just listen to me while I spitball something to try and get it off my chest? Yeah, mate, of course. Everyone is waiting to help their mates, but no one's willing to start. And so if we can connect to, if someone starts, we all just get to, this is fucking great. Oh my God, I feel so much closer to you. And Jesus, that was easy. And I'm not taking all of the shit into my work, into my relationship, into my parenting, it just takes that permission, the starting. And so the permission is, and again, men are waiting for permission. So if someone can lead, beautiful. It gives permission for others, but you also get to give that permission to yourself. So it doesn't actually have to look very hard. And what can come from that is so much, but it doesn't need to, be earth changing or world changing, but it might change your world a little bit. But it's really simple. And, it might just be as simple as, instead of saying, how you going? Good. Like, hey, what's going on at the moment? And how are you going with that? Or, here's what's going on for me. Because again, leading is what provides the permission. Yeah. And I'll add on to that. My experience in starting Beyond the Beers, which is really about creating environments for men to go beneath the surface and talk about the shit that matters. The idea was kind of that to start with, like, men are gagging for this. And once they see it, that's not that hard. I could do that. Right. And I know that to be true, but the more I've done it, the more I've learned. More than that, most men are, I want to do that, but I don't know how or where. Right. And so we get frozen behind that. Now, of course we know how and where. We just don't allow ourselves to actually think of that, because then I have to do it. How or where is like anywhere, and how is to start. Right. And so give them an example, it becomes, I can copy that. And then it becomes a hell of a lot easier.
Yeah, it's a lot easier to replicate something if you're unsure of it, or if you're overthinking it as well, going, there's so much fear around it, so I don't know where to start, so I'm going to overthink it, so I'm not actually going to start it at all. But if you see someone do it, then it's easy to just be like, all of those questions of how does been removed and now I can just do.
Yeah. And the other thing for men to really connect with that is, again, like seeing other men have real conversations. It doesn't need to be, you know, the most earth-shattering conversation, but simply being real and having more open conversations is feeling what you see, which is, that was, you know, something that equates to respect.
Yeah.
Something that equates to admire that. Right. And that's almost like a little push in the back. Okay. You know, I can do that too. And that's really important for a lot of men to connect to.
Yeah. I love that, because it is like, that's how we learn, I think. And I talk about this a lot in other contexts as well anyway, is that we're not meant to figure everything out on our own. We learn from others, even if it's our peers, right? It can be a coach, absolutely. It can be a therapist, it can be whoever, but we're not meant to just sit there alone and figure everything out on our own. We get to observe and watch and learn and give action rather than only telling people what to do, and you get to also demonstrate that. That it's achievable as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, you know, so again, a lot of men have learned that I need to do this all myself, and we become this island, but I mean, they just can't work. And it's very easy to sit and think for a moment, am I really going to be able to do all the things? Was I born with all the knowledge in the universe? No. You know, did I learn how to be an expert in relationships? No. So the information is somewhere. If I don't have it, it's somewhere else for me to go towards. Yeah, let alone, you know, it takes a village, we're raising communities, all that kind of stuff. But like, it's a fairly simple thing for a lot of guys to get, as long as you can, you know, present it to them so they can get it.
Yeah, and it's also, there's no expectation to become an expert in any of those areas either. Like,
no, but this is the challenge for a lot of guys, I feel, is anything, but let's put it in the realm of having, you know, more open, effective, emotive communication. Well, this is foreign, and this is uncomfortable, and I'm not good at it. I'm terrified of getting it wrong. I'm terrified of not being right, you know, of looking stupid, right? Like those things right there, go and ask 10 guys on the street. And if they can be honest with you, so many guys are terrified of those things. Not looking wrong, being wrong, not looking right, not being right, looking stupid, silly, something along those lines. And it all speaks to, you know, a fear of judgment. I mean, one, they're crippling, but they'll stop a guy starting and sucking, because you have to suck. And so often what is coupled with that is, therefore I need to be really good at this. And so they set an expectation that I have to be an expert at this. And it could be, you know, in the realm of a relationship. Yeah, my partner, you know, she does this stuff and she's really into, you know, personal development and reading up on stuff. And, you know, like, I don't feel like I can be on her level or whatever. Well, hopefully she's got the compassion and the wherewithal to not expect that of you and, you know, meet you where you're at. But if he's going to, and he often will, have those expectations on himself, and that will stop him moving ahead even more so, because he doesn't want to not get it right. Yeah. And so frozen, right? And so, like anything, and for any guy and anyone, of course, but there's probably countless examples. But whatever you do for a living, you probably were horrible at before you ever started it. And the first time you did it, you weren't an expert, but you got better each time, over time. And it's the same with communication. It's the same with trying to understand your emotions. And what is that thing? You know, practice.
Yeah.
That's humility. Humble yourself. Sit down and practice.
Oh, I love your work. Thank you so much for joining me. I love these conversations because I feel like there's so much value in, I feel like it is that leading by example just by talking about it, even that alone, just by talking about it, shining a light on it, kind of lights it up a little bit and sends a little bit of that example of this is how, like this is like even just with the thought process and planting seeds and whatever it is. So yeah, thank you so much for joining me. How can people find you and your work?
Easiest thing's probably Instagram. at Mike Campbell MC. You know, Mike Campbell is a reasonably common name, so if you Google it, I tend to fall behind the guitarist for Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers, and now Fleetwood Mac. So, you know, I haven't quite bumped that guy yet. So no, hit me up on Instagram, and yeah, look, reach out if you've got questions. Always happy to hear from people and answer questions. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time, wisdom, and for sharing a bit of your story as well. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.